This lesson is looking at the female sex hormones and how it controls post-puberty and the development of eggs, as well as some of the sex hormones. It's similar to the males in that what you have controlling it is the hypothalamus. Okay, and the hypothalamus releases its own hormone, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone, which we usually shorten to GnRH. GnRH goes to that other one that we know as the anterior pituitary. And if you've done the male first, you will understand that this looks very similar. And the anterior pituitary releases the two gonadotropins, which is LH and FSH. And remembering LH is the luteinizing hormone and FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. They both act on the ovaries and ultimately they go down and deal with the ovaries. But unlike the males, the females are a little bit more complicated because they have the menstrual cycle, and in terms of hormonal control, they have three different aspects of the menstrual cycle. Okay? And the first one is typically known as the follicular phase. Okay, so that's the follicular phase, which is day 1 to 13 in an ideal 28-day menstrual cycle. The second one is ovulation. Okay, and ovulation is when the egg is released, and that is typically in an ideal 28-day cycle. That's at day 14. And then the third is the luteal phase or the luteal phase. And the luteal phase typically lasts day 15 to 28. So when you look at the hormonal control in females, it's typically following, if we're looking at the standard 28-day cycle. Okay, and so the first part of the cycle, we have the follicular phase. And then in the second part, the second phase is the ovulation, which is day 14. And the third phase is the luteal phase. Let's start by looking at follicular phase. Okay, in the follicular phase, it looks very similar to the male phase. We have the hypothalamus releasing the GnRH. GnRH goes to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary releases LH and releases FSH. Okay, and what happens is we'll go to LH, goes to the ovaries, and starts telling the ovaries to produce their hormone, that is estrogen. Which is the female sex hormone. Okay? FSH goes to a specialized area within the ovaries, and it's in the follicle region. So it goes to the follicle region, which is in the ovaries, and what you find is the follicle is where you would find a little piece of tissue and in the center of the tissue is an immature egg. And so FSH is telling the follicle it's going to start maturing the egg, and so it's going to start to mature the egg. Okay? So the next sort of 13 days, estrogen is now being produced. And what is happening here is we are now sending estrogen to the uterine lining to start excuse me, producing the lining of the uterus. Okay, so the first aspects are the uterus lining or the endometrium is going to start being filled, and estrogen is also heading back up to the hypothalamus as negative feedback. Because obviously we've started developing the follicle, we're producing estrogen, we don't need to start developing any more follicles, so the estrogen is going up to slow down the process of GnRH, so we have less GnRH. The follicle will continue to develop and have the egg getting ready to be produced. Okay, so the estrogen levels are continuing to climb, the uterus lining is being built, and we're getting all ready for ovulation to happen. So that's the follicular phase, which is days 1 through 13. So what happens next is day 14, which is ovulation. So if you were to look at it in sort of a graphic mode, and you were looking at the days across the bottom, on day 1, the levels of estrogen, well, the levels of GnRH are going to be high. Okay, so we'll do our GnRH in red. It starts out a little higher, like day 1, the levels will go up, and then they'll start to drop, correct? And they'll keep dropping. At day 1, if blue is estrogen, well, levels are really low, but as this is happening, things are going up, okay? And this is, and if you look at LH and FSH, so LH, FSH, I'm just going to use both of them in green, they're going to be high, and then they're going to keep dropping, right? They're going to follow along with the GnRH. At day 14, so I'm going to say right here is day 14. So as estrogen levels have been climbing, they get to a certain point. And what happens on day 14, or ovulation day, is estrogen, up until then, was negative feedback. But now estrogen has positive feedback to the hypothalamus. Well, think about it. If it's positive feedback and estrogen levels are high, you're going to send out a lot of GnRH. So GnRH goes out, which causes LH and FSH to spike. Okay, so at day 14, LH and FSH is the green. Well, all of a sudden you're going to get a big spike of LH and FSH, and then the estrogen levels are going to continue to climb. Okay, that spike in LH actually causes the egg to leave the follicle. Okay, and now it's free to start its migration into the fallopian tubes or the oviducts. Okay, and what happens is estrogen continues to cause the endometrium lining to continue to grow. And what happens as soon as the follicle is left over, the leftover follicle is now called the corpus luteum. And what happens in the corpus luteum, it starts producing its own hormone known as progesterone. So now once the egg has left the follicle is no longer really called a follicle, it is now the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum starts to secrete and produce progesterone. So progesterone levels, I'm going to use that in black. If you're following along, there's hardly any, and then all of a sudden your progesterone levels are going to start going up. Okay, and progesterone heads off to the uterus, and it says, hey, the egg is left, we better really get going, and that helps to build a strong endometrium. Strong, thick endometrial lining. And so when you think about it, the corpus luteum is now producing progesterone and estrogen. Okay? And you're building a long, strong endometrial lining, and you're getting ready for if ovulation happened and then fertilization with the sperm took place. Okay? And so now, the leftover of the follicle, this is the luteal phase. Okay? So right now, we're into the luteal phase. Because the luteal phase is now building everything up, and it's going to keep going. Now, if there's no fertilization, then after 2 weeks, roughly, the corpus luteum starts to break down. And as it breaks down, then you stop having progesterone and you stop having estrogen, and now the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, is going to be taken away, and that's going to stop having these hormone levels. Those hormone levels are going to drop. Progesterone and estrogen both have negative feedback to the hypothalamus and to the anterior pituitary, so there is no message saying to start over. And all of a sudden, all the levels of the hormones drop, and that is basically the end of the menstrual cycle.